The studio lights blazed down as Stephen Colbert leaned forward in his chair, his signature smirk twitching at the edges, barely concealing the storm brewing beneath. Across from him sat Elon Musk, the tech titan whose presence alone seemed to shift the air in the room, his sharp eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and defiance. Tonight's episode of the show was billed as a casual chat, a chance to peek behind the curtain of Elon's eccentric genius. But within minutes, it was clear this was no friendly exchange. Stephen, known for his biting wit and unrelenting moral compass, had come prepared, and Elon, ever the provocateur, wasn't about to back down. It started innocently enough. Stephen tossed out a softball question about Tesla's latest innovations, letting Elon bask in the glow of his own achievements. The audience clapped, nodded along, captivated by tales of electric cars and Martian dreams. But then Stephen pivoted, his tone sharpening as he brought up reports from Tesla's factories, whispers of discontent among workers, allegations of a culture that didn't just push boundaries but trampled over them. Elon's smile tightened, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest, a telltale sign he was sizing up the battlefield. Stephen didn't relent. He pressed harder, citing lawsuits, employee testimonies, numbers that painted a picture of a workplace where some felt unheard, unseen, dismissed. Was this the cost of progress, he wondered aloud, or something darker? Could a man who dreamed of uniting humanity among the stars really be blind to the divisions festering under his own roof? The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the temperature rise. Elon countered, his voice calm but edged with steel, insisting the claims were exaggerated, cherry-picked by critics who didn't grasp the bigger picture. He wasn't here to play defense, he said, but to talk about the future. Then Stephen dropped the hammer. He brought up Elon's vocal support for Donald Trump, a name that alone could ignite a room. What did it mean, Stephen asked, for a leader of Elon's stature to align himself with someone whose words and policies so often divided, whose rhetoric had been called out time and again for stoking racial tensions? Wasn't that a contradiction, a betrayal of the very ideals Elon claimed to champion? The crowd murmured, some cheering, others bristling. Was Stephen overstepping, or was he peeling back a layer Elon didn't want exposed? Elon's jaw clenched, his gaze narrowing, and in that moment it was clear. This wasn't just a talk show segment anymore. It was a collision course. The exchange grew sharper, Stephen's questions cutting deeper, Elon's responses growing terser. Stephen leaned into the accusations, framing Elon's leadership as not just flawed, but tainted. A man whose brilliance couldn't excuse the shadows cast by his choices. Elon pushed back, accusing Stephen of grandstanding, of twisting facts to fit a narrative. The audience was hooked, hanging on every word, every gesture, as the two men circled each other like boxers in a ring. What had started as a spark was now a smoldering fire, and everyone watching knew it wouldn't take much to set it ablaze. The air between Stephen and Elon crackled with unspoken accusations as the debate barreled forward, no longer a sparring match, but a full-on clash. Stephen, emboldened by the audience's restless energy, doubled down on his line of attack. He painted a vivid picture of Tesla's workforce, pulling from stories of workers who claimed they'd been sidelined, their concerns brushed off, their voices drowned out by the relentless march of innovation. He didn't just stop at the factory floor, though. Stephen wove in Elon's public persona, questioning how a man who tweeted about freedom and progress could ignore the cracks in his own empire, cracks that disproportionately affected people of color. According to the lawsuits piling up, Elon's composure began to fray, his responses growing clipped, his hands no longer tapping but gripping the armrests as if anchoring himself against the onslaught. He shot back, dismissing the lawsuits as opportunistic, the kind of noise that trailed anyone bold enough to disrupt the status quo. He accused Stephen of cherry-picking horror stories while ignoring the thousands of jobs he'd created, the lives he'd lifted. But Stephen wasn't buying it. He countered with a pointed jab, asking if those jobs were worth it when they came with a culture that left some feeling less human, less valued, based on the color of their skin. The trump card came up again, and this time Stephen didn't hold back. He challenged Elon's defense of the former president, pressing him on what it meant to stand by a figure whose words had inflamed division, whose policies had been decried as discriminatory. Elon's eyes flashed, and he leaned forward, his voice rising just enough to cut through the room. He wasn't here to debate politics, he insisted, but to talk about building a better world. Stephen seized the opening, suggesting that maybe Elon's better world only looked that way to those already at the top, those who didn't have to navigate the messier realities below. The audience was fully in it now, some clapping at Stephen's barbs, others muttering in Elon's defense, the divide in the room mirroring the one unfolding on stage. Stephen kept pushing, his tone steady but relentless, framing Elon as a hypocrite who preached unity while propping up systems and leaders that tore it apart. Elon fired back, calling Stephen a sanctimonious gatekeeper, a talk show host playing judge and jury without ever building anything himself. The insult stung, and for a moment Stephen's smirk faltered, but he recovered fast, turning Elon's words into fuel for his next salvo. What had been a simmering dispute was now boiling, over each man digging in, neither willing to yield. Stephen's questions grew more personal, probing Elon's motives, his values, while Elon's retorts turned sharper, laced with a growing frustration that hinted at something explosive beneath the surface. The crowd could feel it, that tipping point where civility starts to crumble, and they leaned in, breathless, waiting for one of them to break. The stage was set for a reckoning, and it was clear neither man was backing off without a fight. The clash had morphed into something raw, almost primal, as Stephen and Elon locked horns with no sign of retreat. Stephen, sensing Elon's mounting irritation, sharpened his focus, zeroing in on the tech mogul's refusal to own the consequences of his choices. He brought up a specific incident, a leaked memo from Tesla that allegedly discouraged workers from speaking out, framing it as evidence of a top-down culture that silenced dissent, especially from those already marginalized. Stephen's voice carried a quiet fury, his words slicing through Elon's defenses, asking how a man who claimed to value free speech could stifle it when it came from his own people. Elon's face tightened, his patience visibly unraveling as he shot back with a force that startled the room. He didn't deny the memo, but spun it as a necessary measure, a way to keep focus in a company under constant siege from competitors and critics alike. He accused Stephen of hypocrisy, pointing out the polished world of television where every word was scripted, every dissent quietly buried off camera. The jab landed and Stephen's eyes narrowed, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he turned the accusation around, suggesting Elon's control-freak tendencies didn't just stop at memos, but bled into every corner of his empire, including how he picked his allies. That's when Stephen went for the jugular. He brought up Elon's recent praise for Trump, not just as a casual nod, but as a deliberate stance, tying it to a pattern of behavior that seemed to favor power over principle. He asked, point blank, if Elon's support was less about ideology and more about cozying up to a figure who'd excuse his own excesses, racial or otherwise. The audience gasped, the weight of the accusation hanging heavy, and Elon's restraint snapped. He surged forward in his seat, his voice booming as he called Stephen a smug elitist, someone who'd never understand the grind of building something real, let alone the compromises it demanded. Stephen didn't back down, his calm demeanor now laced with a steely edge. He pressed Elon on what those compromises meant for the workers who didn't look like him, who didn't share his privilege, who felt the sting of exclusion while he chased his grand visions. Elon's response was a torrent, a mix of defiance and rage, as he accused Stephen of pandering to a woke agenda, of turning a complex world into a simplistic morality play. The crowd split louder, cheers clashing with boos, feeding the chaos as the two men traded blows that felt less like debate and more like a personal vendetta. The breaking point loomed closer with every word. Stephen's relentless probing, his refusal to let Elon dodge the hard questions, had pushed the billionaire into a corner, and Elon's escalating anger was stripping away the polished veneer he usually wore. The audience could sense it, that moment where control slips and something irreparable happens, and they waited, hearts pounding, for the spark that would light the fuse. The studio pulsed with tension as Stephen and Elon teetered on the edge of chaos, their voices overlapping in a tangle of fury and accusation. Stephen, fueled by the crowd's restless energy, leaned into his attack, his questions now less about policy or lawsuits and more about the man sitting across from him. He challenged Elon's moral core, asking how someone who'd built a fortune on the promise of a better future could stand by decisions and men that dragged so many backward. His tone was steady, but the words carried a weight that felt like a slap, each one daring Elon to justify himself not just as a leader, but as a human being. Elon's reaction was visceral, his body coiling as if ready to strike. He didn't just defend himself, he lashed out, his voice rising to a near shout as he called Stephen a self-righteous coward, hiding behind a desk while others took real risks. He painted himself as a target, a visionary battered by small minds, who couldn't fathom the sacrifices he'd made, the enemies he'd faced. The Trump allegiance, he argued, was strategic, a means to an end, not a reflection of his soul, and he spat the words with a venom that suggested Stephen had no right to judge him, no right to even speak his name. Stephen seized the opening, twisting Elon's defense into an admission. He suggested that if aligning with divisive figures was just strategy, then Elon's principles were for sale, his ideals a costume he wore when it suited him. The audience erupted, some roaring in approval, others jeering, but Stephen kept his focus. His gaze locked on Elon as he asked what kind of legacy that left, what kind of world he was really building. The question hung there, unanswered, as Elon's face darkened, his breathing heavy, his hands now clenched into fists. The exchange turned brutal, personal in a way that felt unscripted, unfiltered. Elon accused Stephen of thriving on outrage, of turning his show into a circus to mask his own irrelevance. Stephen fired back, calling Elon a bully who couldn't handle being called out, a king who demanded loyalty but offered none in return. The crowd was a live wire, feeding off the hostility, their reactions amplifying the stakes with every passing second. Neither man seemed willing to yield, but Elon's temper was visibly fraying, his words growing jagged, his control slipping further with each barb Stephen landed. It was clear now that this wasn't about winning an argument anymore. It was about dominance, about one of them breaking the other, and the audience could feel the collision coming. Stephen's relentless pressure, his refusal to let Elon retreat behind charisma or deflection, had lit a fuse, and Elon's mounting rage was the powder keg. The room held its breath, waiting for the moment when one of them would cross a line too far to step back from. The studio had become a pressure cooker, the clash between Stephen and Elon no longer a debate, but a bare-knuckled brawl of wills. Stephen, sensing Elon's unraveling, pressed his advantage, his voice cutting through the noise with a precision that left no room for escape. He circled back to the workers, the lawsuits, the culture Elon had built, but now he made it personal, asking what it said about a man who could dismiss their pain, who could stand by a figure like Trump and call it strategy, who could look in the mirror and still see a hero. His words were a scalpel, peeling back layers Elon had spent years polishing, exposing something raw and vulnerable beneath. Elon's response was a roar, his composure shattering as he surged to his feet, towering over the desk between them. He didn't just defend himself, he attacked, his voice thick with fury as he accused Stephen of being a parasite, a leech who fed on controversy while pretending to care about justice. He mocked Stephen's platform, his audience, his entire existence, claiming he'd never understand the weight of real responsibility, the kind that kept the world turning while Stephen played court jester. The outburst was unhinged, a floodgate of pent-up frustration bursting open, and the audience recoiled, some gasping, others shouting, as the energy in the room turned electric. Stephen didn't stand, but his presence grew larger, his calm a stark contrast to Elon's storm. He let the tirade hang for a moment, then leaned forward, his eyes locked on Elon's, and delivered a quiet, devastating blow. He suggested that maybe Elon's anger wasn't about being misunderstood, but about being seen too clearly, a man who couldn't face the truth of his own contradictions. The crowd erupted, a wave of noise crashing over them, but Elon didn't hear it. His face twisted, a mix of rage and something deeper, something wounded, and he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a growl as he told Stephen he wasn't worth the air he breathed. The insult landed like a punch, and Stephen's mask slipped, just for a second, revealing a flicker of real anger. He rose now, meeting Elon's height, and the two stood inches apart, the desk the only barrier left. Stephen didn't shout, but his words carried a force that silenced the room, telling Elon he'd exposed himself, not as a visionary, but as a petty tyrant who couldn't handle a mirror. The audience held its breath, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself might crack, and in that moment, it was clear. One of them was about to snap, and the fallout would be seismic. The standoff between Stephen and Elon had reached a razor's edge, the two men locked in a glare that seemed to burn through the space between them. Stephen, his voice steady but laced with a cold fury, refused to let Elon's last jab slide. He stepped out from behind the desk, closing the gap, and challenged Elon to say it again, to prove he meant it, to show the world who he really was when the mask fell off. The audience was a chorus of gasps and shouts, some egging them on, others stunned into silence, as the line between talk show and battlefield blurred completely. Elon didn't hesitate. His temper, already a wildfire, flared into something uncontrollable, and he unleashed a torrent of venom that shocked even the most jaded in the room. He called Stephen a fraud, a sanctimonious nobody who'd built nothing, who'd never risked anything, who hid behind jokes while others carried the weight of progress. His words grew cruder, more personal, each one a sledgehammer aimed at Stephen's core. And then, in a moment that would echo beyond the studio, he told Stephen to fuck off, his voice a raw bellow that cut through the chaos like a blade. Thus, crowd erupted, a mix of cheers and jeers swallowing the room, but Stephen didn't flinch. His face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the insult, and then he fired back, his tone ice-cold and deliberate. He told Elon he'd just proven, every word, that his tantrum wasn't strength but weakness, a bully crumbling when his bluff was called. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to, because the weight of his contempt was enough to make Elon's outburst seem small, desperate. The audience felt it, shifting in Stephen's favor, their noise coalescing into a wave of support that drowned out Elon's lingering echo. Elon's rage hit a wall, his chest heaving as he realized the room was slipping away from him. He took a step forward as if to physically reclaim control, but Stephen held his ground, unflinching, daring him to cross that final line. The tension was unbearable, a heartbeat away from violence, and the crew backstage scrambled, sensing the segment had spiraled beyond repair. Stephen's producer signaled from the wings, but Stephen ignored it, his focus solely on Elon, on finishing what had been started. The breaking point had arrived, and it was Elon who'd shattered first, his explosive exit line a misstep that handed Stephen the upper hand. The audience was riveted, their emotions a tangled mess of shock, excitement, and disbelief, knowing they were witnessing something that couldn't be undone. Stephen stood tall, his silence louder than Elon's screams, and in that moment, the power shifted, setting the stage for a reckoning no one would forget. The studio hung in a suspended moment, Elon's outburst still ringing in the air as Stephen stood unwavering, his silence a wall of resolve. Elon, chest heaving, face flushed with a mix of fury and disbelief, seemed to realize too late that his words had backfired, turning the crowd against him. The cheers for Stephen swelled, a tidal wave of approval crashing over Elon's fading defiance, and the shift was palpable. Stephen, seizing the moment, straightened his posture, his gaze never leaving Elon's, and spoke with a calm authority that cut deeper than any shout. He told Elon he'd overstayed his welcome, that this wasn't a platform for tantrums, and that he could take his chaos elsewhere. Elon scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. But the bravado felt hollow, a last gasp from a man who'd lost the room. He muttered something under his breath, a final jab too quiet to carry, and turned as if to storm off on his own terms. But Stephen wasn't done. With a single sharp gesture, he signaled to the side, and the audience watched, breathless, as two security guards emerged from the wings, their presence a quiet but unmistakable command. Stephen's voice rose just enough to be heard, telling Elon he didn't get to walk away like he owned the place. Not after that. The guards approached, their strides deliberate, and Elon froze, his eyes darting between them and Stephen, caught off guard by the escalation. He barked a protest, claiming he didn't need to be escorted, that he'd leave when he damn well pleased, but the guards didn't waver. They flanked him, firm but professional, and the crowd erupted again, a mix of cheers and stunned laughter as Elon was guided toward the exit. He resisted for a moment, shoulders tense, head whipping back to glare at Stephen, but the guard's grip tightened, and he had no choice but to move. Stephen watched, unflinching, as Elon was led out, the studio doors swinging shut behind him, with a thud that felt final. The audience was on its feet now, roaring with a mix of triumph and disbelief, and Stephen turned to them, his smirk returning, but tempered with a quiet strength. He didn't gloat, didn't milk the moment with a quip, just let the victory settle. A host who'd faced down a titan and come out standing. The crew scrambled to cut to commercial, but Stephen lingered, soaking in the energy, the vindication of a line held firm. When the cameras rolled again, Stephen was back in his chair, the chaos a memory, and he addressed the audience with a steady voice, acknowledging the night's fire without rehashing it. He pivoted to the next segment, his composure a testament to his control, leaving no doubt who'd won. The episode ended with the crowd's lingering buzz, a story complete, a confrontation resolved, and Stephen firmly in command, the night's turbulence a badge of honor rather than a scar.